Maiyegun làwa mọ̀ làmọ̀ tó dòdòdò. Maiyegun làwa mọ̀. Good morning to you, good afternoon to you, and good evening to you from wherever you are joining me from. It is Maiyegun Live. Lórí Facebook, lórí YouTube. It will be very much unfair not to conclude this book that we have dedicated over 14 hours so far reading and reviewing. So this afternoon, that is what we're going to do. Conclude the reading and pick whatever you will learn from that history, from it, and make good use of that. For those who have read the book before, this is just a refresher. For those who have never and possibly willing to get it so that they can have it and, process and read it, right? I have advised. This was sent to me from Nigeria. There are bookshops in Nigeria. So just look around for that. It's cheaper and it's easier. Online is a pure rip-off. So, but yeah, we have been following this and we will conclude it. Thank you so much. I know that the reactions have been following last night's broadcast. That is what is expected. I am working on a piece of video that I believe will pretty much help a lot of people answer so many questions too, for those who genuinely want self-determination in Yoruba land. Thank you so much for joining me even on TikTok, and to my friends in the temple right there on Facebook and YouTube. Again, you can listen to this podcast while you do other things, right? You do not really have to sit there and watch, except if you kind of have that free time. This may take us like another, maybe 1 hour, 30 minutes or 2 hours. So we'll make use of that time. Again, I am just going to read, and intermittently, I may be breaking and then, sipping my tea or adding my own review on whatever I have read back to you. So if you can hear me loud and clear, especially on Facebook and YouTube, if you can hear me loud and clear, just raise up your hand and say, yes, you can. So I am going to start now. Thank you so much for joining me once again, everyone. It is a listening podcast now. So while we were reading, when we started this book, we have managed to establish the intention of those who plotted the first coup. It wasn't an ethnic coup, tribal coup, or religious coup. They were simply motivated by what they called nationalism, something they felt could save this new country, newly independent country. But they failed, admittedly. And those who sort of cash in on their revolution twisted it and turned Nigeria to what we are now witnessing today. Somebody once said that, well, the coup plotters themselves are not different. If they had succeeded, there is potential, evidence that Nigeria still won't survive, even with them, right? But we will never know. We will never know. They were convinced that they were doing the right thing at the time, but at the end of the day, because they failed, it turned into a tribal, ethnic weaponry against the people of Eastern Nigeria. So that long story, we've seen those who succeeded them too. Those who continued the status quo, the business as usual. So if you haven't probably been part of that 3 episode that we had on this book, I advise you take a look at the diary, okay? Go check. You will see them there, and you can listen like now. Thank you very much. Now let's get it finished. Chapter 8 is where we are going to continue from today. So we've also kind of saw what was about to lead to the Biafra genocide carried out by Gowon. And in fact, this writer, who happened to be the only survivor of the trio that plotted the 1966 coup, January 15, 1966 coup, Adewale Ademoyega. Okay, to him, the war of Biafra and Nigeria was simply the war of personalities. His view, right? So let's continue. So chapter 8, the Liberation Army. Ojukwu declared his secession on May 30, 1967. By that time, the newly created 12 states of Nigeria were 48 hours old and had started to tick, bringing new life, hope, and a new sense of direction to Nigerians. It has been explained by some people that Ojukwu was waiting for Gowon to take the offensive and so become culpable of pushing the matter beyond the brink. Nevertheless, Gowon's action did not give Nigerians and the outside world that impression. After secession, everybody expected that war would follow. Hence, both Biafra and Nigeria were feverishly getting ready. In Biafra, the real enemy was dubbed the Northerner. Consequently, their own defensive efforts were concentrated towards their northern border. At the same time, because of the economic blockade already imposed on Eastern Nigeria, both Port Harcourt and Calabar were being garrisoned. If there was a side less committed to war, it was Nigeria, where formerly 2 of the remaining 3 loyal military governors were opposed to the use of force. Although there was an emergency in Nigeria and no one could really oppose the mobilization for war, yet the military governor of the Midwest states, the newly promoted Brigadier Ejo, assiduously held his ground, refusing to let his state be used as a launching ground for federal military operations against Biafra. Not only that, he saw to it that the officers and men of the Midwest states, a state command, were not committed to the war. This was a proof of courage in a situation where many stooges would too quickly bow down to a superior authority under the pretext that they had no choice. In Biafra, the war fever had been on for nearly a year. Their governor, now head of state, had always assured them that they would fight to the last man, which in some quarters was interpreted to mean that even in the face of defeat, Biafrans would rather die than surrender. Before the outbreak of the war, The meaning of his expression was hidden from their eyes. I, myself, talking to my radio in my small detention room in Warri prison, always wondered why Ojukwu was sure that he would be finished, especially adding that when his men were finished, the grass would fight. I kept on wondering whether or not he really meant it. Later on, after I had been released to join in the struggle, I realized that Ojukwu knew what he was talking about. He knew that he was ill-prepared for the fight, and that if it came, he had nothing to send against the enemy except the bodies of his own citizens. No guns, no armor, no planes, no ships. Only flesh and flesh and flesh. What a suicide plot. Or was it a reverse program? Did this have to be so? Despite the fact that about 50 Igbo officers were killed during the counter coup, the region was still superior to the remainder of Nigeria all put together in terms of senior and seasoned officers. A very invaluable foundation for the building of an unbeatable army of liberation. In fact and figures, Biafra had 18 senior officers of the ranks of major, and above all, of whom had been commissioned before independence. In contrast, the federal side had only 7, because about 10 others were kept neutral in the Midwest. On the other hand, Biafra had fewer young officers, captains, and below, numbering less than 70 compared with 220 on the federal side. However, the younger officers were easier to make through accelerated training, which the senior officers could organize. In view of this, while I was confined in detention, I could not conceive of the East as not being ready for war. I saw every reason why they should not merely be ready for war, but should be ready to take the whole of Nigeria by storm. In those days, I still believed that Ojukwu was a soldier, although he was not revolutionary. He had always seemed scholarly and soldierly. And if he had the opportunity as well as the means for a fight, he would not miss it. But I was mistaken. The first root shock to my expectation came in late 1967, in March 1967, when I received the first letter from my friend, Nzeogu. He had been separated from me since March 1966, when we were all dispersed from the maximum prison, security prison at Kirikiri. He was transferred to a destination that I did not know in the East, so we lost contact. However, by March 6, 1967, Ojukwu had unilaterally released all the officers and men that were detained in the East for their part in the coup. Nzeogu was released along with the others. So he was the first to contact me. By that time, I was the only officer left in detention. That was because I was detained in Warri in the Midwest. 2 of our officers, Major Okafor and Major Anuporo, who were detained in the West, had both been killed in a most brutal way during the July 29 atrocities. Then, in early August, same year, the other ranks who were detained with me in Warri prison were transferred to Benin prison, where they were to be released. Rather, unfortunately, while they awaited their release, some northern troops who came to Benin from Lagos for some special duties broke into Benin prison and captured the detained soldiers away. All of them were badly beaten, many were injured, and some were maimed. After all that, they were left to scuttle away to their homes. The matter infuriated Governor Ejo, but what could he do about it? From that time until August 1967, I was the only military personnel in that prison. And when my colleagues were released in the East in March, I became the only officer left in detention. Ejo did not do anything about me. He did not even send me a word, although he knew I was there. Some officers of the Midwest Command, like Lieutenant Colonel Unwawo, had already visited me there in late 1966 and expressed their hope that those of us still in detention would be released then, but nothing happened. Then at the Aburi meeting of the Supreme Military Council, it was Ojukwu who raised the point that we ought to have been released. Still, Gowon simply promised to look into it. The reason why we were still being detained was not clear to me. It was Ironsi who had cast us into detention, even after he had promised Unzelgu that those already detained would immediately be released. He did nothing to release us until he was killed. He did nothing to release us. Yeah, the rebels of July 29, 1966, then performed a million times worse assault on the officer corps of the Nigerian army than we could be accused of. Yet, not only did they go unpunished for their deeds or misdeeds, they were also elevated. On what moral ground, therefore, were they still detaining us? On what military grounds? No answer, none whatever. After Gowon was installed in power from August 1966, Lieutenant Colonel Banjo made several overtures to him for his release, Banjo's release. Gowon refused to release him, even though Gowon knew perfectly well that Banjo had not played any part in the coup. The only condition he gave Banjo was that the latter could be transferred back to a prison in Lagos. Banjo did not accept the offer. After the Aburi meeting of the Supreme Military Council, there was pressure on Ojukwu to release Unzelgu and Co. He agreed and unilaterally released those of us who were in the East. It was an act of great magnanimity on his part, because Eastern region was still in Nigeria at that time. As for the lonely me, I was glad for my colleagues, and I believed very firmly that one of Ojukwu's reasons was that he needed corps of the revolutionary officers and men for his war preparations. Hence, I was shocked beyond belief when I read in Unzelgu's letter that he and his non-Eastern colleagues were sent away on an indefinite leave and were not allowed to take part in preparing for the war. Surprisingly, too, he made me to understand that the East was not really preparing for war. The noise was much, but the military preparation was negligible. After reading through this shocker, I started to ask myself if there was anything of the soldier and not everything of the actor in Emeka Ojukwu. Then I said to myself, if Ojukwu was an actor, then he must be a tragedist and not at all a comedian. I was later proved right. I kept on communicating with my friend, Unzelgu. I gave him my own idea, and he told me the real position of things in the East. He was using an Asaba post office box address. So I did ask him where he was. Inside the post office box office, of course, was his reply. Later, his supposed interview with a journalist called Ejindu was published. I read extract from it in both national and international newspapers. So I congratulated my friend for it and associated myself with his views. He replied that it was not really an interview, but a discussion, and that although the views expressed were his, they were not exactly how he put them. Moreover, the publication had already scandalized him in the East, making the authorities suspicious of him. I could imagine what that meant, seeing that he already had a fame for being able to turn the table against any clever dick whatsoever. I only hoped that they would not rearrest him. No doubt, that publication was partly responsible for their unwillingness to give him any command. We kept up our correspondence until the outbreak of the war on July 6, 1967. 3 weeks later, I heard it over the NBC that Nzeugwu had been killed in the Nsukka sector of the war. I was utterly chagrined. Hours later, Biafra denied the report over their own radio. Later on, the federal side confirmed the report and claimed that he was thoroughly identified and that he was given a hero's burial with full military honors. Pictures of him were displayed in the papers. Gowon also paid a tribute to him, saying he was a gallant soldier with principles. Many other Nigerians paid glowing tributes to his memory, and everybody believed that he died a Nigerian, though fighting on the Biafran side. Of course, the federal authority knew that it was they who had confined him inside Biafra, totally against his will. If the Gowon government had released the whole lot of us detained by Ironsi, surely Nzeugwu and the remainder of us would have returned to the places of our choice in Nigeria. Not one of us would have been involved in Biafra. Here, I can do no more than say that Nzeugwu was a first-class soldier and a trustworthy friend. He was studious, ambitious, temperate, knowledgeable, intelligent, and self-controlled. He was devoid of vices. He was single-minded. He was a born leader of men. Generations of Nigerians will yet read more about him and learn a lot from him. Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeugwu Adieu. Now, having said this much, let me add this, and let me add that in spite of all that the federal government had published, I was still somehow skeptical about Nzeugwu's death. For one thing, I knew that he was not given any command in Biafra. I knew that he was not given any command in Biafra again. For another, the news was denied and never confirmed by Biafra. I was yet to know that Biafra was like that. Consequently, on the day that Major Humphrey Chukwuka, one of the leading officers of the coup, walked into my detention room in Warri, carrying a submachine gun in his hand and in the command of an armed soldier, before I listened to him at all, my first question was, did Nzeugwu really die? Yes, he said, in the Nsukka sector. I asked no more questions and was silent for some time. Chukwuka had come to set me free on the day that the liberation had the Midwest. Much earlier, at the outbreak of the war, the prison authorities, who had been extremely kind to me, had told me that since they could not guarantee my safety in the event of the federal troops entering into the area, I should feel free to look after myself. But in the early hours of August 9, 1967, there was noise of rifle fire in Benin, and the news soon spread to Warri. Then it was explained to me that the troops seemed to have come from Biafra. That was a surprise to me, considering that, according to federal sources, Biafra was losing ground rapidly, both in the Nsukka and Ogoja sector. Then again, it was the problem of which side to believe. So the matter lingered with me until Humphrey came into my detention room. I recognized him at once and knew that the Biafrans had entered the Midwest. In a moment, I had packed up and brought out my very heavy box of books, which I had ordered by post from the University of Ibadan bookshop. Actually, I had spent the previous 15 months browsing through the pages of print on every conceivable subject. Surprisingly enough, I found the Holy Bible the most profound of them all. And I found a small book written by a lay woman on the practical realization of the soul, the most useful of them all. I had just successfully performed some experiments according to the teachings of that small book when I was set free. I spent that day with Chukwuka in Warri. He had instructions to send me to Benin as soon as I was released. But he was yet to gather the arms and ammunitions, which he was to send with me. There and then I understood that all kinds of military stores were in short supply in Biafra. Rifles, machine guns, ammunition, artillery, armored vehicles, planes, and whatnot. I was no longer surprised because Ojukwu had written about this much earlier. We drove to the police station and took possession of all their old Mark IV bolt action, single round rifles, and all the available ammunition. It all amounted to very little. After that, there was nothing else except to choose his own headquarters location. We soon chose a secondary school towards the lagoon side, and there we settled for the night. He went and made a broadcast over the local radio. Soon after, Lieutenant Colonel Banjo, the commander of the Liberation Army, had made his own broadcast from Benin. Early the next morning, I left with 2 vehicles, a few soldiers, and a few weapons that we had collected. I was soon in Benin. At the divisional headquarters, I got another surprise. I met my friend, Ifeajuna. He was wearing a lieutenant colonel rank and was now the chief of staff of 101 Division of Biafran Army, now styled the Liberation Army of Nigeria. He received me very warmly, and we were both glad to be together again. Having been detained for 18 months and having lost all hope of ever sojourning again, there we were in action again as revolutionary soldiers. Once more, we were on the course of liberating Nigeria, and it was a moment of true happiness for both of us. Ifeajuna took me to Edokpolo Army Barrack, where my unit was located. I was to command a newly assembled battalion, which was to be part of the 12th Brigade that was built to forge its way to Ibadan. He introduced me to the men of the battalion. Everybody was a new soldier. The best had been trained for only 5 days. They were merely clothed in military uniforms and brought down. Only a handful of them had any weapons at all. They came in civilian vehicles, mostly cars. That was all. I was to organize them into formation, appoint non-commissioned officers, warrant officers, and field commissioned subalterns, lieutenants and second lieutenants. I did not bat an eyelid, but simply went to work at maximum speed. Then I remembered that I, myself, should be in uniform. But I had none whatsoever, and my men had none to spare. I rushed to the headquarters, got hold of Ifeajuna, and collected a pair of his own uniform, his own spear. When I put it on, it had his new badge of the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Later in the day, the commander sent me a message that I had been promoted Lieutenant Colonel. I'm going to take a short break, and you can call it a tea break now, okay? Just to be sure that I am still communicating. You get what I mean? Not too fast, and then clearer enough. Thank you. So let us continue. Later in the day, the commander sent me a message that I had been promoted. Lieutenant Colonel. It was perhaps the first promotion made in the Liberation Army. I went to work again, preparing to liberate the remainder of Nigeria from the clutches of Gowon's rebel army. Back in Edokpolo barracks, I divided my units into companies, platoons, and sections. They were about 700 in number and would make a good battalion if they were well armed. We had managed to seize a few more weapons from the armory of the Midwest Command, which was then at our disposal. However, only 100 or 14% of my men were armed. Since none had used a weapon before, I started training them in the rudiments of weapon handling. At the same time, we were ready to drive up towards Ibadan. If at any moment the order was given. But why was the order delayed? The order was delayed because there was a sharp disagreement between Commander-in-Chief of the Biafran Army, the Commander-in-Chief of the Biafran Army, Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu of the Biafran Army. And then that of the commander of the Liberation Army of Nigeria. You see this complexity here now. Well, let me finish that, that paragraph. In fact, let me repeat that again in clarity so that I know you get what I meant in what I read there, okay? But for clarity, let me take that again, okay? So they said the order was delayed because there was a sharp disagreement between the Commander-in-Chief of the Biafran Army, Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu, and the commander of the Liberation Army of Nigeria, the newly promoted Brigadier Banjo. So what clarity I'm trying to pitch and bring out there is this. In the history that some of us have been, propagated with, was that the Biafran Army, Ojukwu, was going to take over Yoruba land, and it was Biafran Army advancing. We were never really clearly told that the prisoners that Ironsi jailed because of the January 15, 1966 coup, who were part of the now declared Biafra Republic under Ojukwu. Ojukwu released them from the prison. And in their own way, as part of the war, they formed an army they called Liberation Army of Nigeria, but under the Biafran Army. So it was this Liberation Army led by Victor Banjo, a former prisoner of Nigeria, trapped in the eastern part of Nigeria, released and freed by Ojukwu, right? Their own contribution to the war is to say, okay, we are forming our own army and we are going after Ojukwu. We are going after Gowon. I think that clarity is very important. And when the news said, when the report, the history said, Victor Banjo was convicted of treason, that is going against the order of Ojukwu. That part of history was also not clearly stated, but propagated. It was as if Victor Banjo willingly and others like him willingly joined the Biafran army and to be part of Biafra Republic. Okay? And indeed, after doing all of that for the Biafrans, Ojukwu still killed him. Ojukwu is blamed for the intended invasion of Yoruba land. Yoruba land that has been opposed through their own military governor, opposed to any use of military force in Biafra, suddenly realized that there were some army coming in. But this army was not Biafran army. And they were not ordered by Ojukwu, among other things. Just for clarity. Right? The Liberation Army was led by Victor Banjo, who still believe, including this writer, the army he joined is the Liberation Army of Nigeria. How come they didn't say much about the Liberation Army of Nigeria, but we know a lot about the Biafran Army? And every atrocity of this genocide is sort of put on the Biafran Army. We're not told about this Liberation Army, or they made them look like insignificant. But this piece of information can help you to understand that part of history very well. And how propaganda has managed to keep it that way for decades. The Biafrans, they wouldn't have, the Yorubas wouldn't have, be against Biafra, if not because the Biafrans were coming to attack Yorubas. That was easy, but that's not what happened. That's not what happened. But let us continue. Listen to this. Including the takeover of the Midwest. Are you listening? Because when Ojukwu declared Biafra, Midwest, Benin, Warri, they were still part of Nigeria until the Liberation Army of Victor Banjo took over the Midwest. But they didn't say that in their own, propagated history. They said the Biafran armies took over Midwest. And today, you will see the people of our people of the Midwest, some of them, the Benins, fighting themselves over something. Some says they hate Igbos. Okay? Simply because when Biafra was declared, truly, Midwest was not part of it. But those who took over the Midwest, they didn't take over Midwest for Biafra. They took over Midwest in their own believed effort of liberating Nigeria from Gowon's rebel that has now formed government over Nigeria. I think that's very important. That's very critical. But let's continue. The latter wanted to secure Benin in good hands before proceeding to Ibadan, so that he was not suddenly cut off from Biafra. He preferred the name as Ishekiri or Benin, not an Igbo, as the military administrator of the Midwest. Actually, his first choice was Brigadier Ejo, the Eastward military governor. He spent his first few hours in Benin trying to convince the latter to accept the post. Ejo declined and chose to disappear from Benin. He later surfaced in Lagos, claiming that he had traveled by bicycle. Next, Banjo chose Lieutenant Colonel Trimnell and Ishekiri and the director of supply and transport of the Midwest Command. Ojukwu rejected the nomination. By then, Banjo had already made his broadcast over Benin radio, clearly explaining his stance in the crisis. He did not believe in Biafra or secession. He was only out to liberate Nigeria from the oppression of the northern oligarchy, which had installed Gowon in office and mandated him to crush Ojukwu by force. Banjo did not believe that the war was necessary. He believed in the January 15 coup and his laudable aims and objectives, which he would now strive harder to achieve. All this was too much for Ojukwu to bear. He at once recalled Banjo from Benin to Enugu and gave the latter a piece of his mind. Seeing that the entire Liberation Army was sponsored and funded by Ojukwu, there was little that Banjo could do except bow to his request. So, Major, listen to that again. Oh. The Liberation Army was funded by the Eastern region, and their intention was not to liberate Nigeria. They did not want to take over Nigeria. And immediately Victor Banjo was going that route. The person who is sponsoring you was like, come. I'm not going to, no, we are not going to do this. And that simply means you will now have the resources you want to go and use to liberate Nigeria. So this was the beginning of the disagreement between between Ojukwu, Biafra, and Banjo and others who were part of the revolutionary coup, or kind of lumped into the revolutionary coup of January 15, 1966, clearly. So let's continue. He did not believe, okay, that's, what do you call it? That is Victor Banjo. So all this was too much for Ojukwu to bear, so he called him. He said, so, seeing that the entire Liberation Army was sponsored and funded by Ojukwu, there was little that Banjo could do except to bow to his request. So Major Okonkwo, an Igbo medical officer of the Midwest Command, was appointed the military administrator of the Midwest, taking your ground. Banjo was to muster his troop and proceed to Ibadan. If Ibadan was taken, Ojukwu reserved the right to name the military governor, and he had named, listen to this, so he had named Lieutenant Colonel Ademoyega himself tentatively for that post. So here is another twist to it again. The moment Victor Banjo was saying he was liberating, Nigeria for, he was liberating Nigeria from Ojukwu. And the agenda of Biafra was to maintain their own independence and all that. If you want me to fund this, then that means I will have to command or control whatever comes out of it. So Ojukwu joined at that point, I believe. Now let's continue. Third, even this writer was to be named as the military governor of Ibadan, an army led by Victor Banjo, or a liberation army. So if Lagos was taken, Ojukwu reserved, that's what they had agreed. This is like an agreement. Oh. If you go there and do what you want to do, and you take Lagos and you take Ibadan, I reserve the right to name the governor there, since I am the one funding you and your liberation army. So that's part of their deal now, going forward. Here, he also reserved the right to give to Banjo such an appointment as he deemed fit. It was on this basis of this agreement that Banjo returned to Benin early on Saturday, August 12, 1967. By then, the momentum of the initial advance to Midwest, which could have led to the immediate capture of Ibadan, had been lost by 72 hours. By that time, federal authorities in Lagos had recovered from their shock and marshaled a force of a company's strength, supported by ferrets and mortars, to delay the Liberation Army from advancing further westwards. So to them now, the Liberation Army, it is like them versus the Northern Rebel Army, who has taken over Nigeria. That time, it was like another attempt to challenge Gowon and his backers. But they've lost ground. They were ill-equipped. Let's continue. The federal company planted its forward platoon on the hill overlooking Siluko River, which was the most significant landmark between Ore and Benin. The remainder of the company were stationed in Ore at the Ijebu-Ondo junction. They had planted themselves on the feature and ranged their mortars on the Benin-Ore road before our own forces finally left Benin late on the 12th for Ibadan. Actually, what was called the IOI division, 101 division, consisted of only 3 battalions. The 4th was the one newly formed in Benin and commanded by me. The first 3 were the 12th commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Akaga, the 13th commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Evenso, and the 18th commanded by Major Chukwuka. On entering the Midwest on the August 9, the 13th Battalion veered northwards and was located at Auchi to protect the northern flank of the region. The 18th Battalion veered southward and was based in Warri, protecting the southern flank. The 12th Battalion led the advance and took Benin. As soon as they were in Benin, the troops got loose and started to alienate the feelings of the local communities from themselves. But they were soon gathered again to continue the advance. The 72 hours that elapsed between the capture of Benin and the resumption of the advance had lowered both the morale and the capabilities of the troops. This later proved an intractable problem. The 12th Battalion was again the leading unit in the advance to Ibadan. It had a few Land Rovers and lorries which formed the vanguard. The remainder were cars, and purely civilian vehicles. It was followed by my own unit, now christened the 19th Battalion. We were all in cars, and we formed the rear of the movement. The command group of the division was controlled by Brigadier Banjo and was placed in between the 2 battalions. We had already advanced some miles from Benin when we approached the Siluko Hill feature. We did not anticipate any opposition. Otherwise, we should have moved more slowly with headlamps switched off and our forward troops on guard for immediate deployment and engagement. The sudden burst of small arms and machine gun fire, followed by this fall of mortar bombs, came as a rude shock to our super confident and relaxed forward troops. The troops quickly got out of their vehicles since they did not have sufficient training or fighting experience. They hardly knew what exactly was expected of them. So they did not quickly form up to clear the known enemy position. Instead, they were scattered, finding no answers to the enemy mortar. Actually, the whole division had no support weapons at all, not even 2-inch mortars. Besides a few machine guns, the divisions had no high-caliber weapons of any description. At the same time, there was an utter lack of well-trained and battle-worthy young officers who could immediately organize to take the battle to the enemy location. Since the mortar shelling was continuous and since we simply made ourselves fixed and easy targets in our lined-up position, the enemy retained the initiative and continued to harass us where we were. The divisional commander went further forward to assess the situation. After a detailed appreciation of the situation, he ordered the rear unit to return to Benin. We were followed by a gradual withdrawal of the forward troops. It was the first setback of the Liberation Army in the Midwest. We had sustained quite a few casualties, which were evacuated to the military hospital in Benin, Banjo was soon in contact with Ojukwu, stressing our urgent need for support weapons in order to dislodge the enemy on Siluko Hills. By the next day, Sunday, August 13, Banjo had found that my friend Ifeajuna was not very useful to him at the divisional headquarters. Actually, Ifeajuna had not settled down to any serious work since they advanced into the Midwest. The headquarters was not at all organized, and logistical necessities were not properly taken into account. We already had a battle on our hand, and it would no longer be easy to capture Ibadan. That same day, Banjo made a drastic change in his headquarters. He sent for me and briefed me on the political and tactical situation in Biafra. First, he explained, both he and Nzeogu had urged Ojukwu to organize the fight on a national scale, but Ojukwu refused. Nzeogu even volunteered to stretch the Biafran defenses straight to the Benue River line, beyond Makurdi, and to the Benue-Niger confluence in Lokoja. But such an action would at once have put parts of Kaba and Benue provinces on the part of the east, and the war could then have been fought mainly in the north, using both the Benue and the Niger River lines as the natural defensive lines. But Ojukwu would have nothing to do with such a bold plan. Then he further explained he had suggested that they should break the bounds and make for Lagos while the east was still part of Nigeria, so as to enlist the help of other southerners. Again, Ojukwu recalcitrated. It was this that nearly finished the personal relationship that existed between Ojukwu and himself, since their military careers started together in Lagos in the 50s. But how did Nzeogu die? I asked him. Nzeogu was not given any command, he explained. But as you well know, he was not content to remain idle. He simply told himself that he would certainly not sit bemoaning his lot while federal troops were advancing to capture him. He used to take a handful of volunteers on daring raids against the federal troops at Nsukka. That was all he was doing until he fell into their hands. Why did Ojukwu deny the report? I asked him. Banjo smiled and said, but that is what he does all the time. After that, Banjo explained to me that he had formed the headquarters of the 101 Division 3 weeks earlier in Enugu and used it effectively to control the activities of the two Biafra brigades fighting in both the Nsukka and Ogoja sectors. He said that it was he who intervened successfully to slow down the rate of advance of the federal troops towards Enugu. Ojukwu, he further stated, had seen the usefulness of his strategy. As a result of this confidence in him, when he suggested the Midwest and Lagos moves, Ojukwu was obliged to accept. But I do not like Biafra, and I am not a Biafran. He remonstrated. I do not like Biafra either, said Banjo. I told Ojukwu not to declare Biafra. I warned him not to secede. I stayed with him in the State House after he had released me from detention and did everything possible to stop him from declaring secession. He would not yield. The very day that he declared secession, I moved out of the State House into one of the flats belonging to the Electricity Corporation of Nigeria in Enugu and remained there ever since. Then why didn't you take leave of Ojukwu and make a quiet return to Lagos? I asked him. Gowon would not have it. I had been in touch with him since August 1966. His only offer was that I should be transferred to another prison in Lagos. After Ojukwu had released us, Gowon would still not have us step into the Midwest or West or Lagos. This is our only opportunity to fight our way back. But militarily, the situation is quite hopeless. What do we have to match the federal superiority in arms? I asked. Ojukwu is expecting some small arms and support weapons, Banjo replied. He had promised me a good chunk of them. As soon as we can get some of that, we shall continue the advance, Banjo concluded. After that, he gave me the job of his chief of staff, explaining that Ifeajuna was in no mood to settle down into any particular job, but was interested in very many things at the same time. So he was sending him back to Enugu to act as our liaison officer with Ojukwu, so as to help us get those things that we needed to carry on the war. I accepted the appointment and took up my residence at the divisional headquarters location. It was then that I started to study what the division had for its operation. As a matter of fact, the division was very thin on the ground. The only operational battalion was the 12th, which was formed in Ogoja sector before it was transferred to the Midwest sector. Even then, that unit had no support weapons. The newly formed 19th Battalion was not at all equipped. The rifles in the whole unit were not sufficient for a single company. Besides that, there were no other weapons. The 11th Battalion stationed in Auchi was deployed 2 up. One company was pitched at the outskirts of Okene towards the north. The other company was pitched at Agenebode towards the east. The 3rd company was held in reserve at Auchi, the battalion headquarters. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Evenso, who commanded the unit, was soon down at Benin to request for reinforcement. His unit had only 3 machine guns and rifles. They had very little ammunition for the rifles and no support weapons at all. The 18th Battalion based in Warri was also deployed 2 up, having one company at Ugeli, another company at Sapele, and the reserve company at Warri. They had only 2 machine guns and no more, and there were no support weapons at all. This was rather depressing. However, we were expecting a good supply of weapons, including a few 3-inch mortars as support weapons. If this came in time, we would be mobilized. Banjo was quickly summoned to Enugu again, and I kept the headquarters as his chief of staff, deputy commander. Actually, there was very little to command, since we could hardly be said to be operational. However, we were on radio link with Enugu. Besides, reports were coming in from the unit's locations, telling us their urgent needs for military stores, which we could not immediately meet. By Monday 14th, one of the senior officers of the Midwest Command, Lieutenant Colonel Igboba, surfaced and reported to me at the divisional headquarters. I quickly appointed him to command the 19th Battalion, which I had lately formed. He went to the battalion location, surveyed his military worth, and was totally appalled. He rushed back to me to give me his impression that the so-called battalion was simply a rabble. I smiled and ordered him to make a battalion of them. He left and went to work, using his local knowledge to fish out more weapons. He found a few NCOs and young officers and commenced weapon training for the unit. Within a week, we took delivery of a single 3-inch mortar barrel and a few mortar bombs. We also received a number of rifles and ammunition. This greatly boosted our morale. I sent the mortar barrel to the 12th Battalion and distributed the small arms between the 12th and the 19th battalions. Now let me take another break. Call it a tea break. One moment, please. For my friends on TikTok. So there is a bit of verify this, verify that stuff. Thank you so much, okay, for listening, and at the same time for sharing it, inviting those that probably should be listening to this. A lot of people can sit back and enjoy this book, you know, like savor it, digest it, and be able to even like process it, learn from it. Okay, do not become a Nazi, a narcissistic bigot. Do not inherit the enemies mentioned in this book. So learn from them, be better, and never make their mistakes again. There are those who wanted to read it, but do not really have the time. And listening in could do a lot of help in actually, you know, you digesting the content of a book you've read so much about. Some of it have been so misinterpreted. A lot of people have used it for their different agendas. But you who is listening, right? The chance there for you is to actually understand the content, the motive, including every other exposés that came to light from it too. And do not make their mistakes. Because we are reading about the decisions, the actions of men of yesteryears, whose actions and, you know, inactions led us to where we are today. We are the men of today, men and women of today. Our own children will be reading about us in 40, 50 years' time. And if we couldn't really learn from all of this and be better, then we can consider ourselves possibly a failure, not any way better. But let us continue. Because I've had my tea break now. Thank you. So, the 12th Battalion actively went to work, engaging the enemy, location at the Siluko Hill. A little amount of reconnaissance was carried out, and the lone mortar was fixed towards the enemy location, even without setting instruments. Instruments rather. It's actually like sight setting instruments rather. As fortune would have it on that evening, the first mortar bomb fell directly into the pot of soup of the enemy. You have never seen such a terrible scampering in all your life. The battalion commander told me hours later. The enemy abandoned the pot and the soup and the plates and their weapons and what have you, taken into their vehicles, including a ferret. They fled at full speed. At Ore Junction, they told their tales of woe and fear to the accompanying commander. They made it seem as if the whole of the Biafran army was descending on them. He too, without doubting their story, packed bags and baggage and abandoned their Ore position. It was the biggest and almost the only victory of the Liberation Army in the Midwest region. The 12th Battalion took over the Ore position and advanced to Okitipupa on the seaside. Our next plan was to advance to Ondo and so set our feet firmly in the west. From Ondo, we were to advance on 2 axes to Ibadan, the Ore Ijebu Ibadan axis, and the Ondo-Ife-Ibadan axis. However, many civilian supporters soon came to us at Ore to warn us that federal troops had occupied Ondo and that we should go there in full strength to take them. Really? Are you listening? The moment the people, civilians, cited this Liberation Army, they were reporting the position and location of the Nigerian army. This time around, you can say the Gowon army. They wanted this Liberation Army to take them. Go and take them. They are in Ondo. Go with Fufoso. Fufoso, kind of. I can only imagine that, right? Anyway, a young officer was quickly sent to Ondo to survey the strength of the enemy. The young officer reported that the enemy was a division of 2 brigades. On hearing this report, Lieutenant Colonel Akaga refused to go and face them with a single battalion. Lieutenant Colonel Igboba also refused to mobilize his makeshift battalion on the ground that they were not fit to be pitched against that formidable force. The type that was already showing the hell to Biafra at Nsukka, in quotes. That was what that officer said, Officer Igboba. This was the beginning of our trouble in the Midwest sector. From then on, any plan to move further west from Ore along Ijebu-Ode-Ibadan axis was strongly resisted by Lieutenant Colonel Akaga, who argued very forcefully and reasonably that if we moved westward, we would immediately be cut off from Biafra through any or several of their northern approaches to the main Onitsha-Agbo, Benin, Ore, Ijebu-Ode road. And he was neither prepared nor willing to be cut off from Biafra and finished in the West. In war, one is either advancing or retreating. The state of standing still could not be kept for long. The federal troops commander cleverly abandoned their Ijebu-Ode axis to us because he knew that we were strong along that line and concentrated mainly on the northern axis of Ondo, Ikare, Okene, with a view to entering the Midwest from the north, so as to attack us from the rear. Meanwhile, we held the ground firmly at Ore. Our plan to move further westward on that axis had not been abandoned, but a debate raged fiercely between the revolutionary Nigerian and daring group on the one hand, and the reactionary conservative Biafran group on the other. Brigadier Banjo, Lieutenant Colonel Ifeajuna, and Major Alale typified the first group, while Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu, Akaga, and Major Okonkwo typified the other. The revolutionary group wanted us to carry on the advance, enlist the support of the West, and pursue a national fight against the feudal NPC revisionists. This was the first time since January 1966 that there was a nucleus of a force that desired once again to revolutionize Nigeria. But the reactionary group wanted us to remain in the Midwest, declare it the Republic of Benin, and fight for its defense in the same way as in Biafra. Although arguments were sound on both sides, the ground did not seem tenable beneath either foot. And whether the ground was tenable or not, here was a clear case of dangerous disagreement at the top over the most vital matter of strategy at a most delicate moment in wartime. How would this terrible conflict be resolved? What chances had we of making it either way? What chances had we of making it either way? Ojukwu's first reaction was to recall Banjo from Benin. He kept the latter in Enugu for many days. Meanwhile, I was running the divisional headquarters with the assistance of Major Ogbu and a few officers. Many visitors were calling from Enugu for various undisclosed reasons. Major Alale also called frequently. Alale was a lecturer in politics at the former Kwame Nkrumah Institute of Ideological Studies. He was a very interesting character, mercurial, intellectual, revolutionary, dialectical, and above all, a great orator. However, he very rarely discussed with anybody. He already lectured everybody, individually and in groups. He was said to have lately married a relation of the head of state of Biafra. Wherever Alale pitched his intellectual camp, it was always difficult to dislodge him. At first, in the eastern region with Ojukwu, later in Biafra with the revolutionaries. When once I explained to him the hopelessness of the Biafra military situation, he at once lectured me on he at once lectured me on his pet theme: revolutionary must never despair. I learned at once that I should never say much to him because it would be a waste of time. One particular group came from Enugu, disguised as political commissars, with the duty to help me with the political aspect of the Midwest war. Oddly enough, they had neither experience nor training for the job and wanted me to give them the necessary training. I believed them and I organized classes for them on elementary tactics and how to undo soldiers in the battlefield. In response, they asked me many intelligent but sensitive questions. At the close of the first day, they seemed to have heard enough and asked for permission to return to Enugu and come back. But they never did. It was then that I realized that they were Ojukwu's secret agents. They expected me to speak against Ojukwu, but were disappointed. That was Biafra. There were very many secret agents. It was therefore easy for revolutionary officers like Banjo and Alale to fall foul of them and land in Ojukwu's net. Especially Alale, who spoke of revolution everywhere, every time, and to everybody. Banjo was not talkative. Banjo was not a talkative, but he was brutally frank and did not conceal his criticism of Ojukwu at any time. I spoke to him quietly about this, and I feared for him, but he would not change. It was 2 weeks after our success at Ore, when suddenly I saw Colonel Ivenso at my headquarters. He was looking quite distraught and sick. What has happened? I asked. He spoke quietly. Federal troops had taken into the Midwest from Okene. They shelled his forward company location for more than 12 hours before moving in. They dislodged him completely and advanced 3 miles southwards. He regrouped his men and the numerous casualties were evacuated. He was still keeping his headquarters at Auchi, but badly needed reinforcements by way of personnel, support weapons, and ammunition. Moreover, he was sick and would want another commander to replace him. I considered the need for a rest to Ivenso while I sent for Igboba to relieve him personally and reinforce the 11th
with its 19th Battalion. Besides that, there was nothing by way of reinforcement that I could send to that front. Although we had captured over 100 mortar bombs at Ore, their own barrels did not fall into our hands. The captured bombs were 81 mm, while our lone barrel was the 3-inch type. It was therefore not possible for us to use those bombs. I sent frantic messages to Enugu, explaining that our northern flanks had been breached and that we urgently needed support weapons. Federal troops soon resumed the advance by leaps and bounds, sometimes making 10 miles a day. Igboba had deployed his 19th Battalion forward on the same axis to reinforce the badly battered companies of the 11th. Still, these were not sufficiently equipped even to slow down the rapid advance of the federal forces, which were a division strong and were well equipped with up-to-date weapons. They were also aided by white, mostly British mercenaries. Soon, Auchi was threatened, and there was yet no response from Enugu, and Banjo was not allowed to come down. After waiting a number of days, and I decided to take up the matter personally at Enugu. This became urgently necessary because in the meantime, Colonel Akaga, whose battalion was yet deployed along the Ore axis, was lost in part. Along Ore axis was lost in part of the forest westward of Benin. The news of his loss was startling and dismaying at a time when we already had a hot war in our hands. So I left for Enugu to intimate the commander of the Liberation Army with details of the situation. In Enugu, I found my way to the flat where Banjo was staying and told him everything. I particularly warned him that if he would not come to Benin, I would also not return there. My reasons were twofold. First, our hope of going further west was sinking fast, and it did not even seem as if our stay in the Midwest was secure. Secondly, I knew that Ojukwu was very difficult to work with. I had had the experience in Kano, and it was not funny. If Banjo, his friend and co-equal, could not successfully work with him, how could I, who had hardly seen eye to eye with him, I'll take that again. I jumped the line. So who could hardly see eye to eye with him at any time, we would in all probability be pulling in opposite directions. If that was allowed to happen, I knew too well we would suffer for it. Therefore, I was most anxious to avoid taking direct orders from Ojukwu. I would rather that Banjo took orders from him and I from Banjo. Banjo took the Midwest problems quickly to Ojukwu. When he came back, he was optimistic that we would get some help and we would both return to Benin. I was relieved. Then I telephoned His Excellency and got an appointment to see him the next day, simply to pay him my compliments. After that, I took up accommodation at the Progress Hotel and spent the evening with my friend Ifeajuna. The next day, I drove to the State House and saw His Excellency. It was all pleasantness. He congratulated me on regaining my freedom, and I thanked him for it. After that, we discussed tactics. His views was that the federal government did not have sufficient troops to be engaged on many fronts at the same time. As such, he proposed to do another surprise advance towards Ilorin. This will force Gowon to withdraw his troop, both from the Nsukka and the Midwest. If that happened, he himself would recover in those abandoned places and then spring another surprise. He firmly believed that the federal government could not win the war, but would soon be forced to abandon the costly enterprise. At that stage and time, I did not share his optimism at all. I could see that he had grossly underestimated the federal might and had overlooked the ill effect of his own utter lack of preparedness and loss of very valuable moments of action. All the same, I was not in the mood to argue with him, and in any event, I could not have convinced him. Rather, I brought up the problems of the Midwest and the reverses we were suffering, and asked what exactly he could do to help us most urgently. We both studied the map together. We saw the problems. He thought for a moment, then promised me immediate aid. Incidentally, he had a mortar barrel of 81 mm. He would give it to the Midwest. I was very pleased, almost happy. I gave him a decent salute and left. 2 days later, a number of rifles were released to us, and the lone mortar barrel was also given us. Boxes of ammunition were added, and we were ready to go. I traveled earlier than Banjo in order to organize the reinforcements for the Auchi front. Surprisingly, Igboba was around again to make an urgent request for reinforcement. He also disclosed that the men were not doing well at all, and that at the slightest prompting, they would desert the front, skip the battalion headquarters, and make their way straight to Benin to sleep in one of the school dormitories or terrorize civilians in the town. I promised to see those soldiers soon. It was at this time that a new person reported to me. He introduced himself as Major Achuzia. He claimed to have fought for the British in South Korea and to have fought with the Chinese in their wars. He was, however, a mechanical engineer by profession. He claimed further to have been sent from Enugu to join the Midwest operations because he hailed from Asaba. I welcomed him warmly and told him that we were always in need of more officers, especially veterans. He followed me to one of the dormitories occupied by the deserters. On getting there, I gave orders for the men to assemble. There were more than 200, most of them with weapons and ammunition. They looked well and able-bodied. There was no reason for them to be around. Their main complaint was that federal troops were accompanied by white mercenaries. In a very angry mood, I reprimanded them for deserting the front. I reprimanded them for deserting the front. I reminded them of the purpose of the war and threatened to shoot them down if they did not awaken to their duties. To show that I meant what I said, I cocked my submachine gun and fired a few shots into the air. Many of them shuddered, and a few made to run away. But I warned them that if they ran, I would finish them. After that, they quietly filed into waiting vehicles and were driven off to the front. A few hours later, Achuzia disappeared from my headquarters. After a few days, Igboba was back again with very bad news. Auchi had fallen. The troops would not stay to fight and were running back to the battalion headquarters. This time I jumped into my staff car and drove straight to the battalion location, where I saw the troops milling around. I ordered them to assemble and inspected them. I packed out a few of them and sent them on physical punishment. I spoke to them again and assured them that I would set up a field court-martial to try all deserters and that those found guilty would be shot. This last condition seemed to have had a telling effect on them, and after that, fewer ran back. The next day, Igboba was around again with the news that the enemy was almost at Irua Junction. From there, they will most likely send a force of 1 brigade strength to Agbo in order to intercept our communications and most probably cut off our link with Biafra. Also, it did not want to continue with the job because the federal side had a preponderance of weapons and were assisted by white mercenaries. In addition, he was utterly disgusted with our troops. I persuaded Igboba to return to his duties, but he would not budge. Since the commander was around, I took Igboba to him. Igboba repeated his situation report and his own decision not to return to the front because, he explained, it was too hopeless. The commander coaxed him to return to the front using persuasion, cajolery, threats, and inducements, all in quick succession. No response. Then, what did Igboba think that his example would be to others? No answer. The commander ordered him to be sent into detention at once. He was escorted to Benin prison, where he was detained. The only senior officer who was around and immediately available was Major Odiwo, who was once an infantry officer in the Nigerian army, but transferred to the newly formed Nigerian Air Force in early 1964. I summoned him quickly to take over the operation in Irua front. He was ready and willing. That same night, I went around the dormitories and gathered some of the war front deserters. They were slightly more than a platoon in strength and had weapons and ammunition. Their task was simply to do some snipping raids and harassment on the enemy before dawn, so as to upset him and disorganize his plans for the following day. I briefed Major Odiwo on his duties, and he claimed that he understood it and would do it very well. I mounted the troops in a truck and carried Odiwo in my staff car to the front. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. We drove close to the enemy position, but they were not aroused. We got out of the car and walked closer to the enemy in order to form up. We saw a woman who was escaping from the enemy position, and she indicated to us that they were quite close. Major Odiwo briefed his men, and they formed up and moved towards the enemy. I turned back and returned to the headquarters. That was the last I saw of Odiwo till the end of the war. A few days later, his name was announced as having crossed over to the federal side. The death of senior, well-trained officers that faced us in the Midwest operation was not easily explained. There were no less than 14 senior officers of the ranks of major and above in the region when the Liberation Army moved in. Of course, only 3 were known immediately to have escaped to the federal side. One claimed to have wounded himself while trying to escape from the area of military firing, and he was hospitalized throughout the period of the Midwest War. Of the remainder, only 5 stayed to operate with us. Others simply crossed over to Biafra and were variously employed. As soon as I was back at my headquarters, I signaled Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuka, the commander of the 18th Battalion in Warri, to report to Benin immediately for a new deployment. He reported and I briefed him on the war situation and told him that I was sending him to the Irua front Fortunately, Captain Adeleke, who had been with us since the coup, had just been sent to us from Enugu headquarters. I sent for him at once and made him the second in command to Ojukwu. The two of them made a good pair and were off in no time. It was only that sanity, it was only then that sanity attended our fortunes at the northern front. The enemy still pushed us continuously, but the rate of push went drastically down. Every morning, they would encounter a new defensive location. Every evening, they beat back our counterattack. For once, they ceased to make it a jolly ride towards Benin. For once, formally, we were running. Now, we were really fighting. Before the enemy entered Irua, I had ordered the 11th Battalion Company at Agenabode to move to Irua and build a powerful defensive position on Irua-Agbo Road, so as to prevent the enemy from flanking to our rear. This precaution worked very well. The enemy carefully avoided the Agbo Road defenses and turned rather towards Benin. This was a longer approach to our Benin-Agbo-Onitsha axis, and we had a longer time to face them. It was fortunate at this time that one of the famous Biafran Red Devils, ancient pre-World War II armored vehicles, was sent to us. Also, Ifeajuna brought us a Molotov cocktail, an explosive and destructive bomb. Both were sent to the Irua front, and they helped to slow down the advance of the enemy. It was at this time that Lieutenant Colonel Akaga surfaced again. He claimed to have been lost in the bush for 12 days, until at last he found his way back to Benin. I congratulated him on his safe return. However, he looked hale and fresh, not like someone who had been sleeping on treetops without a decent food for 12 days. I took him to the commander, who also congratulated him. He claimed to be tired and was given a fortnight off. He left for Biafra. Before the reappearance of Lieutenant Colonel Akaga, rumors had circulated that he was killed in a fake ambush laid by Brigadier Banjo. Spreading rumors was the stock in trade of people who were keen to malign their opponents. It was a dangerous weapon and was frequently used in Biafra. However, it was not unfortunate and rather disturbing. Sorry, it was most unfortunate and rather disturbing that this particular rumor was still repeated by Madiebo in his book, earlier referred to in this book, published 10 years after the end of the Civil War. Madiebo wrote, Colonel Akaga lost his command Land Rover and all his escorts in the ambush, but managed to escape and make his way to Onitsha, a distance of 100 miles on foot. The ambush was organized and executed by our own forces, acting under somebody's instructions. What a colossal lie. Surely, Madiebo had had sufficient time to have found out the truth. While the battle raged, our northern front and we were putting in all we had. It became quite obvious that our total defeat in the area was only a matter of days, not weeks. Militarily, we had no legs to stand upon. In the first place, we did not recruit soldiers in the Midwest. If we did, we would have diverted the full resources of the states, men, money, and material into the war effort. Was this really feasible in the circumstances? Certainly not. Biafran entry into the Midwest was seen by the people especially the non-Igbos of the states, as an act of foreign aggression. Although Banjo proclaimed his own independence of Biafra and his aim of liberating the whole of Nigeria from the hands of the northern feudalists, he was yet to prove it. He had to move further west, capture Ibadan and Lagos, and call for a national fight against feudalism. That is, he had to reignite the revolution before he could make himself credible. To be sure, that was his original purpose. But that purpose was compromised and almost totally destroyed the moment we ceased to push westwards. Even if we had captured the West, had we managed to push our way forward, no matter how slowly, we could have got the whole of the South involved. The forces would have been divided, and our cause might have been vindicated. The cost of the war would then have gone either way, much depending on our own ability to convince the people to fight on our side. There was no doubt that there were forces in the West, as well as in Lagos, who would have taken to our side. As long as the Western and Lagos moves were not fulfilled, the Midwest move remained stillborn. The longer it lasted, the worse. The people did not feel that they were part of the operation. They gradually got more hostile. As soon as the federal troops had started to push down in earnest, they were welcomed as true liberators. It would have been a totally different story if it was Eastern Nigeria and not Biafra that entered the Midwest to continue the political struggle of old. They would not have been regarded as foreigners. The change of name certainly alienated the Midwest people from the Biafrans. Consequent upon this point, and consequent upon Gowon's Decree 14, which made the 12-state structure a reality, the idea of declaring the Midwest an independent republic of Benin was an anathema to the people because it was not their own making, and they were not prepared for it. Their former governor, Ejo, had won their hearts and convinced them of their neutrality in the conflict. It was therefore not easy for a foreign-led and foreign-backed regime to readily change their minds. The third sore point was the behavior of the Biafran troops in the Midwest. This led to a lot to be desired. They behaved like an army of occupation and not of liberation by molesting the people. These problems could have been solved if only the units had had their complement of officers or something near to it. Not in this reverse case where a whole battalion had only 1 or 2 seasoned officers. When the Oba of Benin, Akenzua II, and his chiefs summoned me to one of their meetings, they did not discuss how the liberation of the Midwest could be made a reality. They simply wanted the menace of the Biafran troops removed. Although Banjo had taken the precaution of asking the troops to remove their Biafran army badge from their uniforms, what difference did that really make as to their nationality and behavior? Now, if we had no military leg to stand upon, did we have the political? This problem really agitated the commander of the Liberation Army. On this question of Nigeria unity, I agree with Gowon, said Banjo. Unfortunately, Ojukwu knew it too, and that was why he did not really want or allow Banjo to remain in Benin for long. He always called Banjo back within 24 to 48 hours of his arrival in Benin. So how difficult is that? Ojukwu just wanted Biafra, right? And they were not interested in taking over Nigeria. So this conflict of interest. The conflict of supposed leaders of liberation. That wasn't really, Ojukwu wasn't interested in taking over Nigeria. But it also had his eyes in the spoil of those who were interested. So put it this way, Ojukwu was not interested in fighting the rest of Nigeria. But this liberation army led by Banjo, funded by Ojukwu, right? They are hell-bent on taking over Nigeria and saving Nigeria from Gowon. Ojukwu objected at first, but the moment they said or agreed that if we succeed, we'll give you the honor to appoint the governor. We'll give you the honor of appointing this or that. So he was interested in like, okay, yeah, if you succeed, fine. But if you don't, just know that I am only interested in Biafra, kind of. So this conflict of idea of interest actually ended up working in the interest of in favor of Gowon, because Ojukwu at the time as well, despite having this arrangement with these guys, and he knows their ambition, he could have cut them up and said, listen, I'm not interested, cut it off. But he didn't. He kept supporting them and the rest. Then he kept sending spies after them to sort of understand their mindset, what they have in mind. So this one, like I said, this is the some complexity of history that if you begin to review it, you begin to ask questions about the mind of these men that time. Because the way I understand this is this: so Ademoyega and this guy, Ifeajuna, Ademoyega, Banjo, the two of them did not believe in Biafra, and Ojukwu knew that they did not believe in Biafra. These two guys believed that they could fight Gowon, okay, by taking over Ibadan and Lagos and seeking the support of the South. If they can win the support of the Southerners and make it their war, they can then advance forward and take over the North and dislodge Gowon. Ojukwu knew about their ambition too. But he allowed it. He didn't cut them off like, no, I'm not interested. No, cut it off. He didn't. Then one of them got punished for disrespecting or disobeying Ojukwu's order. The people that are indeed not like, we're not going to be part of that, you knew. So when you begin to look into the minds of all these men, as part of the history you are reading, then you realize that they are actually men after all. They are just mortals. They are men like me and you. The circumstances actually, or let me say, destiny and circumstances pushed before them a great deal of responsibility. Like you have to be responsible for the lives of millions of people and all of that. And in the process, you have to also be careful of those who want to get rid of you and then come for those people. Like that. So they were all men after all. Men. Let's continue. So they said that Banjo tried to contact Gowon, which means some of them are even still trying to reach out to Gowon. They're still reaching out to some of those people that they are fighting war. Remember, this is already war already going on. Oh. This is not like them negotiating for anything. There's already war. People are already dying on both sides, from all fronts. Here you get now. So in this phase of war was when they were making all these decisions. Do this, do that. No, don't do it. Don't do it now. Do it next time and all of that stuff. But let's continue. If Ojukwu knew that Banjo wanted Nigeria united, that is to say, not merely that the remainder of Nigeria should stay as one, but that the name Biafra should disappear from the East, did Gowon also know it? If the Liberation Army could not liberate Nigeria from Gowon's feudal masters, could it liberate the East from Ojukwu secessionist masters? These were the questions that Banjo strove to answer in the few days and hours that he spent at the headquarters in Benin, and what answers did he find for them? Since Ojukwu will not approve the advancement and idea of Banjo, which is now costing them the war, they decided that maybe they should even plan to take over and get rid of Ojukwu himself. His idea is dangerous. Let's continue reading. Banjo tried to contact Gowon through official sources, but he did not tell me whether or not he succeeded in doing so, and whether or not he reached any agreement with him. I, for one, was deeply involved in the battle operations, and I was almost daily at the front to be sure that we did not yield an inch to the enemy unnecessarily. Therefore, I could not discuss in detail with Banjo before he finally left Benin. A few days before then, Ifeajuna visited me in Benin and discussed the political solution as a possible alternative to the military in view of Biafra's very heavy and continued loss of men, material, and credibility. Enugu, he said, was badly threatened and could fall any minute from then. It could be tragic to wait for that to happen. Besides, if the federal side won militarily, they will perpetrate the worst possible genocide on Easterners. Look at that they had, look at all that they had so far done in the captured areas. Real and unwarranted massacre, looting, arson, rape, and worse things. He emphasized to me that Ojukwu was totally intransigent and that a political solution, if any, might have to be put into effect without his consent. Remember that Ojukwu swore that they will fight to the last man. This political solution move, were being made behind him to start with. Okay? So I told my friend that I had always believed in revolution, provided it was going to be successful. Otherwise, it would be pointless starting it. Where exactly were his chances of success in this proposed solution? He explained to me that it was simple and that there were many others who believed that they would easily achieve the aim. I knew too little about Enugu and his arrangements to argue with him. But knowing him the way I did, I had my reservations. He soon left for Enugu. That was about September 16, 1967. By September 17, I was again at the war front, and very unfortunately, I learned that Captain Adeleke, our staff fighter at the front, had been badly wounded and taken to the General Hospital in Agbo. Our defensive work was terribly weakened from that day. Not that Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuka could not perform, but he needed the courage and strength of someone like Adeleke to back him up. By that time, the enemy was less than 6 miles from Okpara Junction, on the outskirts of Benin. If our defenses were truly weakened, which indeed they were, the enemy would make that distance in less than a day. If, on the other hand, we could still keep them in check, as we had been doing of late, we should have 4 clear days to keep them out of Benin. After that, we would, of necessity, move the headquarters to Agbo. Should the enemy occupy the Okpara Junction before we move the headquarters, we would be cut off from the Benin-Agbo-Onitsha axis. Although we would still get out through a long detour via Sapele Much time will be lost, and the enemy might even seize the initiative and take Agbo before we could reach it. Therefore, it seemed tactically wise and necessary to move the headquarters out of Benin at least 24 hours before the enemy took the Okpara junction. By the early hours of the 18th, I was again at the war front to give an essential backing to Ojukwu. We still contained the enemy to beyond 4 miles of Okpara junction. On my getting to the headquarters, however, there was a message from a reliable federal source through the police network that federal seaborne troops would land in Warri any moment from dawn on September 18. If that was already happening or would almost immediately happen, our ground in Benin would be completely untenable. For one thing, our force in that part was not strong enough to resist the successful landing of the federal troops. The 18th Battalion stationed in that port was a ragged, ill-equipped, and ill-controlled unit. Reports of their lawlessness in town had been scandalous. The new commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Unsudo, was a young and inexperienced commander. I signaled him at once to hold the port against the federal invaders, but I knew what to expect. I went straight to discuss the situation with the commander, who told me that he seemed to have won his battle against those forces that had always denigrated him in Enugu, for he was now invited to take up the appointment of Chief of Defense Staff. This was a newly created post to command and control all the Biafran forces on the various fronts to bolster up the Biafra war efforts. He made a quick appreciation of the Midwest situation. He understood quite clearly that Benin will soon be locked in, both from the north and from the south. As such, he ordered me to move the headquarters to Agbo in the evening of the same day. As soon as the order was given, I sent signal messages to the 12th and the 18th battalions that the headquarters was moving to Agbo. Banjo himself had got in touch with the military administrator, Major Okonkwo, who also was well equipped of the tactical situation. Brigadier Banjo left Benin for Enugu early in the afternoon on the 18th and promised to be back to Agbo in another day or two. Later that evening, I moved the headquarters to Agbo, but I did not give up my continued defense of the city. It was only the tactical headquarters that I had to move away so that we would not suddenly be locked in and made easy prey to a ruthless and unscrupulous enemy. The dawn of the 19th saw me again at the battlefront. I deployed the mortar group, zeroing them, though without any sight-setting equipment or instruments, on the enemy position. When they commenced shelling the enemy, I went forward to our front line. The enemy soon started their counter-bombardment, using both artillery and mortars. Before long, they had silenced our mortars. By 6 in the morning, they had started moving, and within 2 hours, at that juncture, I went off at a tangent in order to command our mortars to take a fresh position. When I got to the mortar position, I found that they had left the place. I then tried to find my way further in the area to see if I could trace them. I was walking along a bush path, and had only my batsman, personal servant, with me. Suddenly, I looked up, and a little forward in front of me, along the same bush path, a rope-like stem of a creeping plant was hanging from the branch of a tree. It was hanging right above the bush path, and It moved forward and backward, twisting at the same time, as if it had only just been disturbed. I stopped and became apprehensive. I ordered my Batman to go a little forward to observe whether or not there were people ahead of us. As he moved forward and was under the hanging stem, a burst of machine gun was opened on him from right flank. He ran further forward and disappeared from my sight. It was too dangerous for me to move forward. So I turned right around to return to the area that I was coming from. After moving 5 steps, another machine gun fire opened up in front of me from the same flank. Obviously, I was between 2 enemy machine guns, and they were observing me without me seeing them. They could not be our own troops since we did not even have 2 machine guns in our combat formation. I turned sharply right in the only direction opposite to the positions of the machine guns. It was a bush, but I entered into it and moved so fast that one would imagine that I was on another bush path. The 2 machine guns opened on me, but I kept my own direction until I got out of their ranges. After that, I found my way to Agbo Road and returned to the headquarters. My Batman did not rejoin me, and I have not heard anything of him ever since. Later that day, I telephoned Banjo, and he was glad that I came out alive from the ambush. He told me that Enugu was calm and that he would be back the next day in Agbo. From the way he spoke, I knew that he had some news for me, which he would not disclose on the phone. So I was expecting to see him the next day. One sec. I've been too far away from that screen, by the way. So let us continue. To my utter surprise, the next day, September 20, brought me a totally different kind of news. I received a military signal from the headquarters in Enugu, appointing me as the commander of the Biafran troops in the Midwest and requesting me to confirm my acceptance of the offer. That was really shocking. It will bring me directly under the command of His Excellency, Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu, the head of state of Biafra, with an exclamation mark like, certainly not. I signaled back, declining the offer, and I went further to ask, what has happened to Brigadier Banjo and the Liberation Army? Little did I realize that I was stepping on a tail of a wide boar. Honestly, I was fully occupied with the activities of the battlefront, and I received no information whatsoever on what was happening in Enugu. At dawn on the 21st, I still went to the battlefront. At that time, the enemy was on his last leg to take Okpara Junction, and I knew that they would soon enter Benin. I returned to my headquarters in Agbo just after midday. Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuka was with me, and at about 14 hours, 2 p.m., we both settled down to a good meal. We had not gone far with the meal when all of a sudden, Major Achuzia and another officer, both in uniform, walked straight to my dining table and both pointed their guns at me and said, "You are now under arrest. Hands up, or we shall fire." Gosh, I was extremely infuriated. I was boiling with anger. So I shouted at them, "Okay, you wait till I have my own gun." I got up immediately from my dining chair, left both of them standing there, dashed into my bedroom, took my submachine guns, caught it and then said, "Right, if you attempt to shoot me now, I will finish both of you." They did not move. Thereupon Chukwuka intervened, saying that there was no need for a fight. Then Major Achuzia, who was notorious for recklessly killing the troops on his own side, piped down. He said that he did not come to arrest me, but to summon me to His Excellency. Why didn't you say that? I had been to see His Excellency before. Did you have to threaten me? I remonstrated. After that, we parleyed. If it was to see His Excellency, I would do that. I said, I had no intention of fighting both the federal and the Biafran forces at the same time. But I would not accept blackmail either. I finished my meal and handed over the duties of the headquarters to Chukwuka. I packed my baggage into my staff car and was off to Biafra. As I was going, I still knew nothing of what was happening in Enugu, and nobody gave me any hints. But I knew for sure that I would not return to join the Biafran forces in the Midwest and would neither volunteer nor accept to fight in Biafra. My car was escorted by the Achuzia group up to the entrance to Onitsha. After that, they vanished. It was nightfall before I reached Enugu. I went straight to Banjo's flat. He was not there. The lady I met there told me that he had gone to see His Excellency since morning and had not been back. Beyond that, he did not know exactly what the situation was. I unloaded my luggage and stored them in Banjo's flat. After that, I drove straight to the government house. It was unusually quiet. The usual crowd of workers and waiting visitors was not there. The aide-de-camp was not even around. I was ushered into a sitting room where I sat alone. So I relaxed. After a short while, a gentleman dressed in police uniform but wearing a lieutenant colonel rank came to me. "Are you Lieutenant Ademoyega?" he asked. "Yes," I answered. The man sat down but said nothing. A few minutes later, he rose up and said, "Let us go." I followed him without a word. I still had no clue as to why the atmosphere was so somber, almost still. He entered a waiting car and I sat by him. I observed that my staff car had disappeared. Still nothing was spoken between us and I asked no questions. We drove through Enugu and we were soon in front of the prison gates. He went to speak to the gateman and came back to call me out. We both entered the prison. It was past midnight, but the superintendent of the prison was there to receive me. Take good care of him. My gentleman guard said to the superintendent, "He is not one of them," he added. After that, he left. The superintendent made some entries in his books and asked me if I had any luggage or valuables that he could keep for me. Nothing at all. I really had nothing on me because I had just kept everything in Banjo's flat. My personal weapon had been dropped with the security forces at the gate of the state house, as the custom was, and it was not given to me when I was leaving the place, contrary to the custom. In any event, that was the last thing I needed in a jailhouse. Within a few minutes, the superintendent had taken me into one of the cells and locked me there. Oh, was I back in detention again? It was exactly 44 days since I came out of it in worry. I thought, but I shed no tears for the change of detention place and no tears for all that happened in between. Before daylight, I was removed from the first cell into another one in a rear building. Those prisons usually had special or reserved cells, which had maximum security. Only special prisoners or detainees who were never allowed to mix with other prisoners stayed in such cells. That was why there was a day before I was moved there. It was soon daylight, and after doing my physical exercises, I was opened to go to the backyard for a bath. No sooner had I entered into the corridor that I heard someone shouting, "Wale, Wale, Wale." Looking a little way ahead, I saw my friend Ifeajuna in another cell. Again, I was taken aback. What the hell had gone wrong? I wondered. "Wale, when did you come?" he asked me. "Last night," I answered. Then I quickly narrated my story to him. We had been condemned to death for intending to overthrow Ojukwu, he told me, and we shall be executed. We shall be executed any moment from now. I could hardly believe my ears. I was totally dumbfounded. Unless a miracle really happens, we shall soon be shot. Banjo, Alale, Agbam, and myself, said my friend. If I wanted to weep, I could not find tears. So I pleaded with the warders to let me speak to Banjo in another cell, not far away. They refused. I pleaded over and over again. No way. I turned round to speak again to my friend, but the warders would not let me remain with him. I should go for my bath. They insisted. I said goodbye to my friend. "Look after my wife and children," were his last words to me. I took my bath quickly and returned to my cell. It had an iron door and I could see through. It was located at the approach to the main door of the building. So that from the cell, one could clearly see the head and shoulder of whoever was approaching or leaving the building. For this reason, I perched myself at the iron door, watching who would leave the building that day. Just before midday, I saw the heirs of the 4 men as they left the building under escort. First, Ifeajuna, then Alale, then Agbam, and lastly, Banjo. I could not speak to them. It was the last that I saw of them. That was on September 22, 1967. It was on that same day that the enemy entered Benin, and only 6 days before the enemy entered Enugu. I came to know it much later that Ojukwu had charged those 4 for an intention to overthrow him and also for subversion. Mind you, for an intention to overthrow, but not for attempting to overthrow, because they had not actually attempted. But I understood that the actual excuses he gave to the general public was that Banjo had abandoned Benin. The enemy was yet 2 kilometers away. Another excuse given to the general public was that thousands of Nigerian pounds were discovered by Nigerian security forces in the flat of Brigadier Banjo, and that the money was given to him, Banjo, by the British High Commission. This much is certain, that there was no real attempt to overthrow the government of Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu, and that the evidence of Brigadier Madiebo that he was consulted on the possibility of overthrowing Ojukwu's government was absolutely uncorroborated. Even the evidence of Bernard Odogu, that he was at the meeting where the intention was formed was also uncorroborated. One Mr. Godwin Unzegu from Onitsha, a lawyer by profession, was named by Ojukwu as a member of the special tribunal instituted against the 4 officers. The members of the special tribunal, the members of the special tribunals had been ordered in advance to convict the 4 on the flimsy and uncorroborated evidence given by the prosecution witnesses. Unzegu refused to accept such an order because, to his mind, it would be totally unjust to convict the accused on hearsay. He was detained for his refusal to carry out the order, and he remained in detention till the fall of Biafra. He told me this personally because we were in the same detention places throughout the war. As previously explained, the charge that we abandoned Benin was ill-conceived. If the enemy were to find our headquarters locked in within Benin, what would be our justification? And what kind of tactics would that be? The enemy was within striking distance of Benin in the northern front. If he was still far away on other fronts, would he have waited for his slower front to catch up before entering Benin? The enemy was prevented for 3 more days from entering Benin by our own action. Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuka is still alive today. This was 1981 when this book was written. We slugged it out together at the war front. If we were wrong, why was it that Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu himself moved out of Enugu on September 26, 2 days before Enugu fell? And did we have to offer odds of civilian as cannon fodder to the enemy as he, Ojukwu, did for 3 full days before moving out of Enugu? Finally, the charge that Banjo took money from the British High Commission was utterly false and frivolous. Ojukwu himself knew that to be so. Ojukwu and Banjo had been friends since the 50s, and the former knew perfectly well that the latter was not a gold seeker. Banjo was a well-to-do officer and was quite comfortable. He had no need to look for cash. Banjo entered the Midwest with no more than the 5,000 pounds given to him for the operation. He had not spent more than 500 pounds before he handed the remainder to me for the operations. While in Benin, he received several instructions from Ojukwu to break into Central Bank, Benin, and remove whatever money that was there. Banjo completely refused to do it, saying that it was not honorable. It was on the same principle that he refused to destroy the autonomy of the Midwest. Ojukwu did not cease to pester him about the need to break into the bank, but Banjo would not yield. He brought the instruction to my knowledge, and I supported his view that such an action was not honorable and should not be carried out. Later reports, however, indicated that the forces that entered into Benin after us did not treat the bank as a sacred institution, as we did. Nevertheless, Banjo was an honorable officer who had no need to, and certainly did not obtain blood money from the British Commission or from anybody else. The truth was that Ojukwu needed a scapegoat for his utter lack of preparation for the war and for his failure to find the means of supporting the soldiers in the field. If Banjo was responsible for the fall of Benin, was he also responsible for the fall of Enugu at the same time? No matter how he looked at it, and independent observer would see that from the beginning to the end, Ojukwu was tacitly sponsoring mob persecution and destruction of seasoned Biafran military officers on the false premise that they were responsible for many of the calamities that befell the people of Eastern Nigeria. For 31 months, from May 30, 1967, surely history will not forgive him. Jungle Justice, chapter 9, the last chapter of this book, and the possible end of this reading. So it is called Jungle Justice. I would initially take calls, but today we won't be taking calls. And because our time is far gone and far spent, I actually initially thought we could finish it in time, but the next 15 or so pages, let's see how many pages. It can take us like another half an hour. And I really want to get prepared for tonight. So what we're going to do is this. We are going to continue tomorrow. So we'll conclude this tomorrow. And then we'll continue this too. A fatherless people. The secret story of how Nigerians missed the road to the promised land. So, gentlemen, brethren, I want to say thank you very much for watching this. And for those asking, indeed, it is live and it's almost coming to an end now. I will see a lot of us later this evening. Indeed. So thank you so much for your time. And thanks for sharing too. Okay. And yes, you can add your review and your own views and all that to this reading during our next meet. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Maiyegun làwa mọ̀ làmọ̀ tó dòdòdò.
Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun #1.
Maiyegun làwa mọ̀ làmọ̀ tó dòdòdò.
Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun #1.
Maiyegun ti dé o, ọ̀rẹ́ ará ìlú.
Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun #1.
Lórí Facebook, lórí YouTube.
Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun #1.
Gbogbo bó ṣe ń lọ ni Maiyegun já wa sí.
Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun #1.
Àṣírí ọ̀jẹ̀lú kì í bò níbẹ̀ o.
Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun #1.
Bó bá ṣe eré, àní Maiyegun máa wí.
Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun #1.
Ó sì tún ṣe eré, wàá gbọ́ níbẹ̀ o.
Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun #1.
Maiyegun Diary, Diary political.
Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun #1.
Godfatherism kò sí lọ́rọ̀ Maiyegun.
Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun #1.
Ẹ farabalẹ̀ sẹ́ o kẹgọ́rọ̀ lẹ́nu o.
Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun #1.
Àní Maiyegun làwa mọ̀ tó dòdòdò.
Maiyegun Diary, Maiyegun #1.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé. Maiyegun ti dé.
Ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Lórí Facebook.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Lórí YouTube.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Bọ́ bàbá gbé wúrẹ́.
Maiyegun máa wí.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Ijó ìgbádìyẹ.
Maiyegun máa wí.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Pẹ̀sìdó bá rúfin o.
Maiyegun máa wí.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Bí gómìnà kówó jẹ.
Maiyegun máa wí.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Ọlọ́pàá tí ń gba rìbá.
Maiyegun máa wí.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Aṣòfin tí ń rúfin o.
Maiyegun máa wí.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Òpùrọ́ olóṣèlú.
Maiyegun máa wí.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
Àní ẹ̀sùn ràkì.
Maiyegun ti dé.
ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ súnra kì. Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ súnra kì. Ṣùgbọ́n ní bá ti ṣe èyí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe ọmọ bá dèrò ní fi wọ́n níran o.
Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ súnra kì. Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ súnra kì. Ṣùgbọ́n ní bá ti ṣe èyí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe ọmọ bá dèrò ní fi wọ́n níran.
Wọ́n fowó bẹ́ẹ̀ o Maiyegun ó sọ pé wọ́n ò bẹ́ẹ̀. Wọ́n fowó bẹ́ẹ̀ Maiyegun ó sọ pé wọ́n ò bẹ́ẹ̀. Oníkan ṣáàtì ṣe èyí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe fáwọn ará ìlú tó gbé wọn débẹ̀ o.
Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ súnra kì. Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ súnra kì. Ṣùgbọ́n ní bá ti ṣe yìí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe ọmọ bá dẹ́rọ̀ ò ní fi wọ́n níran.
Kì máa yí ṣeré ọ̀rọ̀ yìí kì í ṣẹ̀fẹ̀. Kì máa yí ṣeré ọ̀rọ̀ yìí kì í ṣẹ̀fẹ̀. Ẹni bá ti lè lẹ́bọ̀ lẹ́rù o ọmọ bá dèrò kàṣà ìtú wọn síta.
Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ súnra kì. Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ súnra kì. Ṣùgbọ́n ní bá ti ṣe yìí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe ọmọ bá dẹ́rọ̀ ò ní fi wọ́n níran.
Tẹnitẹni ọmọ Maiyegun ọ̀rẹ́ ara ìlú mọ̀mọ́ ni mo fọlọ́hún ṣọ́ ẹ̀ bá kìlẹ́bù. Lóòótọ́ olódodo ìlú ọ̀tá ìlú mọ̀mọ́ ni ìwọ ṣá máa ń ṣọ́ra kò sì mọ́ bẹ̀rù. Bọ́tà ń lè rí bóníṣègùn lé káwọn mọ̀mọ́ fi ṣera wọn ni ó ti dẹrùn tí wọn ò gbọ́dọ̀ sì mọ́ bẹ̀. Èèpo ọ̀bọ lọmọ bá dérò tàjẹ́ ò gbọ́dọ̀ jẹ́ ó ti dọba lórí àbínú ẹni kò sì mọ́ bùyà. Àìsíwọ́lu ní ẹnìkẹ́ ìgbódì ẹyin lábàrá o ó kó ẹni tó bá dán o àkàmù. Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ túnra kì. Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ túnra kì o. Ẹni bá ti ṣe yìí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe ọmọ bá dèrò òní fi wọ́n níran o.
Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ súnra kì. Maiyegun ti dé gbogbo ọ̀jẹ̀lú ẹ̀ súnra kì. Ṣùgbọ́n ní bá ti ṣe yìí tó yẹ kí wọ́n ṣe ọmọ bá dẹ́rọ̀ ò ní fi wọ́n níran.